The University of Tilburg is an impressive modern campus. Its large glass windows reveal lush greenery outside. It's ranked in the top 400 universities globally and attracts thousands of talented students from Holland and around the world. Notable alumni include chart-topping Dutch artists, political leaders, award-winning journalists, and Olympic gold medalists. Those who graduate hear this as they enter the graduation hall. It is Tilburg's unofficial anthem, blasted out of concert-sized speakers to welcome the new graduates. Tilburg is where the award-winning Dutch psychologist Diederik Stapel gained international prominence. After joining in 2006, he quickly went from an unknown academic to a world-famous researcher. Alongside his impressive research, he co-founded the Tilburg Institute for Behavioural and Economics Research and became Dean of the Social and Behavioural Science faculty. He rose to fame after conducting remarkable experiments on how someone's surroundings can influence their actions. He published a remarkable paper in the highly reputable journal Science. Stapel discovered that merely passing through a dirty train station or walking down a street filled with litter made people think racist thoughts. Stapel's research specialises in metaphorical priming. Metaphorical priming reveals how our expectations can activate concepts in our minds that are metaphorically linked. So, for example, seeing physical filth primes his participants to think filthy, racist thoughts. Later, in 2011, he ran an experiment in which participants were asked to stand within or outside a large box. It turns out that due to metaphorical priming, standing outside of the box made participants think more creatively, generating more innovative ideas. In a separate study, he released a strong fish odour into his classroom and began asking his students how much they trusted one another. The result was astonishing. Students became more suspicious of each other when the room smelled fishy. In another of his papers, cited hundreds of times in the press, participants held a cup of warm coffee and chatted with strangers. The warm coffee caused the drinker to rate the stranger as having a warmer personality. Stapel's research suggested that holding a cup of coffee on a first date could make your partner seem more attractive. These findings are astonishing. They captured attention, propelling Stapel into a high-ranking university position. Publishers discussed lucrative book deals, and Stapel looked destined to join Cialdini, Thaler, and Kahneman as the next household name in psychology. But there was one crucial difference between Stapel's studies and those of his peers. Stapel never conducted his studies. His experiments weren't real. The fishy odour didn't exist. Holding a warm cup of coffee won't make Dutch students fall in love with strangers. Stapel fabricated the data. All of it. Now, before discrediting a lot of his work, I should add that priming is a genuine and very powerful nudge. Priming can subconsciously influence people to think of objects like the Easter Bunny or the colour orange. To explain, let me try a little test on you. I'm going to ask you to think of something, and you must remember the first thing that pops into your mind. Ready? Okay. Think of a vegetable that grows in your garden. Are you thinking of a vegetable? Well, I reckon you're thinking of a carrot. Am I right? Well, priming suggests I should be. See, I used subtle cues to prime you. Earlier I said Easter Bunny and the colour orange, and these terms may have led you to think of a carrot. Priming doesn't just work for gimmicks like these. Many of the studies in the field go much further. For example, one study conducted at Harvard in 2018 discovered how interview candidates performed better after staring at a picture of a briefcase for 30 seconds. Another experiment by Dr. Peter Lyers from the University of Groningen asked referees at a local football game to smell beer before the game. The beer apparently primed referees to act aggressively, making them more likely to give players red and yellow cards. And one heavily cited study conducted in Stanford in 2002 revealed that wearing thick jumpers made participants more likely to book a ski holiday over a beach vacation. Diederik Stapel conducted many studies that produced results similar to this. He conducted his most well-known study at Utrecht train station in the Netherlands. At this large, modern station, the busiest in the Netherlands, Stapel and his team positioned themselves on the train platform next to a row of seats. In his study, the seats were unoccupied except for one seat at the end of the row. Either a white or a black person was occupying that seat. For the study, Stapel asked white passengers to take a seat while they were completing his survey. Now, the survey wasn't crucial to Stapel. Instead, he was interested in where the white commuters decided to sit. He analysed how close they chose to sit to the other person on the bench. Did they sit right next to them, or did they sit further away? For his study, he created two different scenarios. In the first scenario, the row of seats was surrounded by rubbish. In the second scenario, the seats and the surroundings were clean and litter-free. He found something rather shocking. People sat further away from the black person when litter surrounded the seats. Stapel concluded that unclean environments make people more prejudiced. In other words, messy train stations can make a Dutch commuter a bit racist. It's not hard to see why this study gained so much attention. It's a surprising finding that probably encouraged town councillors to spend more on garbage collectors, office managers to hire more cleaners, and teachers to keep classrooms tidy. After publishing it in Science, arguably the best-known journal in the field, Stapel became a household name. But this fascinating study at Utrecht Station had one significant problem. The row of seats that Stapel described, well, they didn't exist. There weren't any seats at Utrecht Station that matched Stapel's description. He had fabricated the entire study. He never ran the experiment. He didn't even visit Utrecht Station to see what the seats looked like. Hopefully, you find this rather shocking. Not just that a scientist, a reputable professor, a dean would fabricate data, but that science would publish it and that no one would notice, even the peer reviewers. It took almost a decade before someone discovered his lies, and yet cases like this aren't as rare as I'd hope. The book Nobody's Fool does a fantastic job of highlighting other examples of other fraudulent researchers. Researchers like Karen Ruggiero, a professor at Harvard. Ruggiero interviewed 240 people in her experiments and found that high-status individuals, like CEOs, politicians and lawyers, were more likely to blame their failures on discrimination. Unlike low-level managers, black CEOs would blame their slow rise to the top on racism. Young entrepreneurs would blame their lack of funding on ageism, and disabled managers would blame their poor pay on their disability, whereas low-status individuals who faced the same prejudices wouldn't blame discrimination. The study was eye-catching. Ruggiero essentially said that female celebrities blame their shortcomings on sexism, but non-famous females don't. These findings were published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, one of the world's most prestigious and recognised journals. And yet, just like Stapel's work, the study was totally fabricated. It never took place. That's not all. There's a famous 2012 study conducted by Dan Ariely, a study that I'm ashamed to say I've shared as truthful on Nudge before. Ariely discovered that car drivers are more honest about their yearly mileage if they sign their declaration at the top rather than the bottom of an insurance contract. Dan Ariely claimed that signing at the top primed drivers towards honesty. Those who did admitted to a 10% higher yearly mileage than those who signed at the bottom. In other words, the primed drivers were more honest. Except it wasn't the unprimed drivers who were dishonest. It was the researchers. 9 years later, a group of researchers proved that the data couldn't be real. They reviewed the original dataset and found some strange anomalies. For example, most car owners drive between 2,000 and 15,000 miles a year. Far fewer drive much more than that. However, in Ariely's dataset, drivers were just as likely to report driving 10,000 miles, a reasonable amount, as they were likely to report driving 49,000 miles, a very high amount. No other dataset on drivers' mileage had a pattern like this, suggesting that the data was probably tampered with. The data also contained many duplicate rows, each with a random number between 0 and 1,000 added to disguise the similarity. This, it seems, was clear evidence of fraudulent data. These fabricated studies are damaging because they garner incredible attention, shift beliefs, even after they are proven to be false. However, there's one researcher who's perhaps a little bit more guilty than the rest. She's the researcher who presented the second most popular TED Talk of all time.
So I want to start by offering you a free, no-tech life hack. And all it requires of you is this, that you change your posture for 2 minutes.
Amy Cuddy's popular talk has been viewed 71 million times on TED.com.
I'm a social psychologist, I study prejudice, and I teach at a competitive business school. So it was inevitable that I would become interested in power dynamics.
Her 2010 study is pretty simple. Cuddy asked 42 people to hold their bodies into power poses for 1 minute each. So, some participants leaned back on a reclining chair, placing their feet on a desk. That's a power pose. Others stood hand on hips with their feet wide apart. Another power pose. After holding those poses for just 60 seconds, something incredible happened.
So this is what we find. Risk tolerance, which is the gambling. What we find is that when you're in the high power pose condition, 86% of you will gamble. When you're in the low power pose condition, only 60%, and that's a pretty whopping significant difference. Here's what we find on testosterone. From their baseline when they come in, high power people experience about a 20% increase, and low power people experience about a 10% decrease. So again, 2 minutes and you get these changes.
That is a shockingly large change in willingness to gamble and a shockingly large change in testosterone. But that's not all. Amy Cuddy reported decreased cortisol levels, those are stress levels, and stronger feelings of power. This sounds incredible. You can see why this TED Talk is so popular, and probably right now one of those 71 million viewers is preparing for a salary negotiation with their boss standing in a cubicle holding a power pose. Yet, despite the study's incredible popularity, follow-up experiments have found no evidence of hormonal changes or risk-tolerant changes by holding power poses. Those were the key findings of the study. In fact, nobody can replicate this study, and now one of Amy Cuddy's collaborators has denied the power pose findings.
And also, I want to ask you to share this science, because this is simple. I don't have ego involved in this. Give it away, share it with people, because the people who can use it the most are the ones with no resources and no technology and no status and no power. Give it to them, because they can do it in private. They need their bodies, privacy, and 2 minutes, and it can significantly change the outcomes of their life. Thank you.
It can significantly change the outcome of your life. That's what Amy Cuddy has told almost 100 million people. And yet, her advice is based on incredibly thin evidence. Even if this data isn't fabricated, the study involved just 42 participants, which is a tiny sample size. How can someone possibly claim that a finding based on a study so small could change everyone's life? It's ludicrous. Yet Amy Cuddy, Dan Ariely, Karen Reguero, and Diederik Stapel made these claims because they could. It's easy to make claims like this and receive plaudits. It's rare to be questioned. To explain why, I'll need to introduce Lustfaust. Lustfaust was a pioneering band from West Berlin that had been active since the mid-70s. It was involved with the early industrial, noise and electronic musical experimentation. Out of disdain for the norms of the music industry, Lustfaust distributed their music only on cassette tapes. The band left the inserts blank and encouraged their fans to create their own album art. Thousands of fans shared these creative covers through the band's official fanzine, Falk Trachen. The German singer Blixa Bargeld described their disproportionate influence on electronic music, saying, "Lustfaust were really a blueprint. Without their presence and developments, our band would have never existed." However, the band that actually never existed was Lustfaust. Lustfaust never created music. The band never had fans. The songs were entirely made up. British conceptual artist Jamie Chauvelin invented the band. He fabricated the band's origin story, members, songs, and touring schedules. He also hand-drew all of the fan-drawn art. Jamie designed the Lustfaust touring posters in one afternoon at his London studio. Jamie also created Lustfaust.com, an extensive website for the band, complete with news of a reunion tour and an accompanying blog. He set up a MySpace page and even got a short Lustfaust entry into Wikipedia. To explain why there weren't any full-length recordings of the songs, Jamie lied that band members were suing each other over copyright abuse. Only these short snippets of Lustfaust tracks were available to play, clips like this. As Dan Simmons writes in his book Nobody's Fool, this hoax was a social experiment on trust. Jamie Chauvelin exhibited the band's memorabilia in New York and London. Chauvelin expected the visitors to realise he was lying, to realise he was making it up. After all, those who turned up loved 80s electronic music. Surely they'd enter the exhibit and quickly figure out it was all bogus. But they didn't. The visitors never realised it was a hoax. A few even told Chauvelin that they remembered seeing the band perform live. Visitors fell for the hoax not because they were gullible, but because all of us have a bias for trust. Officially, this is called the truth bias, and this bias is well documented. In 2015, Chris Street and Daniel Richardson asked participants to watch 18 videos of people telling stories about their travels. The participants were told that half of these stories were true and half were lies made up on the spot. Yet, the results revealed a truth bias. The participants judged that 65% of the speakers were being truthful, rather than the 50% who they were told were being truthful. This bias for truth is known by con artists around the world. It made one French-Israeli fraudster a multimillionaire.
Gilbert Chikli has stolen millions from some of the world's biggest corporations. His lavishly furnished home in Israel is a compound with security cameras. It's a sign of his success.
After his arrest, Chikli was surprisingly open about how he conned so many.
We understood that a bank president does what he pleases, and via orders he gives, he can end up doing all kinds of impossible or unimaginable things. Therefore, I decided to pretend to be a president.
He'd call a large company's mid-level manager and pretend to be the company's CEO. Then, Chikli would ask the manager to transfer a large sum of corporate funds to his bank account. The con only works because of the truth bias. Most of us naively assume that people are telling the truth. We don't think to question them. By default, we believe, especially with authority figures, whether that's assuming you're talking to the CEO of your business or reading a paper in a well-known journal like Science. We think they are telling the truth. Diederik Stapel got away with his deceit not because he was manipulative and cunning, but because people were inclined to believe him. They didn't think to question his results. They have a bias for truth. But there were more weapons in Stapel's armoury. There was another bias he used to fool the world. And it's a bias that we need to be wary of because con artists, lying researchers, and cult leaders use this bias to manipulate us. In the early 1950s, Chicago was booming. Industry was in a post-World War boom, entrepreneurs were thriving, and immigrants were living the American dream. And yet, in one leafy suburb, a small group believed the world was about to end. This cult of doomsdayers was small, never numbering more than 30 members. The group was highly secretive. They never shared their purpose with the outside world. When journalists asked to speak to them, they refused. A middle-aged man and woman led the cult. They both claimed they could receive messages from spiritual beings known as guardians. Initially, these extraterrestrial communications sounded a lot like traditional Christian thought. "Love thy neighbour," the guardians said. "Blessed are the poor." But later, the messages took a dark turn. The guardians told of an impending disaster, a flood that would begin in the Western Hemisphere and eventually submerge the world. We know this because 3 researchers from the University of Minnesota covertly joined the cult to study how it operates. The trio watched the group for months, documenting how the members joined, how they behaved, and how they became convinced that the Guardians would save them. The cult sincerely believed that the Guardians would teleport the members into space just as the flood hit. Metal, the cult members were told, would interfere with teleportation, so men ripped their zippers out of their pants and donned rope belts. Women removed metallic wiring from their bra. On the eve of the apocalypse, the 30 cult members sat quietly in the living room of their leader, coats on their laps, ready for salvation. But salvation never came. When the clock struck midnight, no flood hit, no UFO hovered, and no teleportation took place. The group was shocked. Some shouted abuse at the cult leaders. Others stood mute, unable to comprehend the situation. But just when the cult was about to fall apart, the Guardians sent a new message. The flood, they said, will come soon. It has not been avoided. It has only been delayed. We delayed the flood to give you all time to save others from death, they said. Share our message. Tell the world about us, and those who believe will receive salvation. Incredibly, every cult member believed this new message. They were utterly convinced, even those hurling abuse minutes earlier. All members got to work on the new mission to share the message. They called journalists, they set up interviews, they printed pamphlets. The researchers from the University of Minnesota noted how, ironically, the cult became more committed despite the absence of an apocalypse. There was no flood. It should be evident that the cult leaders lied, yet their belief increased. Robert Cialdini describes these events in his book Influence. He writes that the cult's increased commitment wasn't strange. No, Cialdini thinks it's pretty normal. It's normal because they're falling for a bias that affects us all, the confirmation bias. The group's members had committed too much, giving up everything for their beliefs. They couldn't bear to see their beliefs destroyed. The shame, the economic cost, the mockery would be too great to bear. One of the members, a young woman with a 3-year-old child, said, I have to believe the flood is coming on because I've spent all my money. I've quit my job. I quit computer school. I have to believe. Instead of spotting the hoax for what it was, the cult members found new reasons to confirm their belief. It is a textbook example of the confirmation bias. The confirmation bias is a tendency to search for, interpret, favour, and recall information that confirms one's prior beliefs. The young mother did just that, ignoring the clear evidence that the cult leaders were lying and instead finding more evidence for her prior belief that the Guardians were real and that the flood is still coming. Now you might think these doomsdayers are totally different from you and I, but the author Daniel Cohen urges you to consider the confirmation bias and think differently. He says it would be a mistake, however, to put down the modern catastrophist as a fraud, a fool, or a madman. Usually, he is honest, intelligent, and quite sane. He is simply devoted to an incorrect idea. I believe that many of Diederik Stapel's fans were also devoted to an incorrect idea. They believe that everything published in a journal is true. They believe that scientists never lie. They believe that people can be metaphorically primed to change their actions. So when they read Stapel's papers, they favoured his results as they supported their prior beliefs. They were more likely to recall his findings because his findings built on their existing knowledge. People believed Stapel, Ariely, Cuddy and Ruggiero because their insights weren't too radical. They were similar enough to other reputable studies, and that made them easier to believe. I'm pretty sure the confirmation bias has helped Stapel because I've tested this bias on you. Now, I hope you listen to this podcast because you believe I share your studies. You believe I'm diligent in my work. You believe I'm trustworthy. So earlier in the show, when I said priming was a genuine bias, you believed me. You believed me when I told you that job candidates performed better after staring at a briefcase. But I lied. I made this 2018 study up. I told you that referees who smelt beer before a football match gave more red cards. But I made this up too. You may have figured it out when I told you that the experiment was by Dr. Peter Lyers, but you probably didn't. I told you that wearing a thick jumper made participants book a ski holiday over a beach vacation, but it doesn't. Yet you believed all these things due to confirmation and truth biases. You believe in behavioural science. You believe I'm trustworthy, so confirmation bias and truth bias kicked in, and you believed my lies. Eventually, Diederik Stapel was caught. His fraudulent Utrecht train station study was the final nail in the coffin. The scientific journals have retracted 58 of his papers. There's an all-time leaderboard for retracted authors, and he sits in 7th place. 2 years on, Diederik Stapel explained why so many people believed him in an interview with TEDx.
In my professional life, I became obsessed with results, by finding answers, by finding what I expected to find, by finding what I thought was logical. That became my obsession, and it pushed away all the other goals. It was my carrot that was in front of me, and I was running behind the carrot, and it wasn't there, of course, it was a moving target. And when I was chasing this carrot, all the other things above me, besides me, underneath me, became unimportant. I didn't see them. I got blind. I got blinded by my goal.
He went on to say, what I made up was logical and not earth-shaking. In other words, his fake studies were similar enough to garner attention but not skepticism. As Dan Simmons writes, they were consistent with what everybody else expected, so nobody looked too closely. That's how this lying psychologist fooled the world.